G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. Hey, what is your favourite fairy or fairy phenomena? Or your favourite book or film or even song? Well, if you're anything like me, it's almost impossible to choose. It depends on my mood or the vibe around me. So when faced with the question, what was my favourite fairy sighting or encounter of the year? No, it was impossible to say. And that is why this video is a compilation of sightings. One to suit every mood and every vibe. I hope you'll enjoy them too. So sit back, relax, and join me as we immerse ourselves in the in-between, the places where fairy dwell. Some years ago, a woman living in Kerry declared that she had been overlooked by the evil eye. She had no pleasure in her life and no comfort, and she wasted away because of the fear that was on her, caused by the following singular circumstance. Every time that she happened to leave home alone and that no one else was within call, she was met by a strange-looking woman, totally unknown to her, who, fixing her eyes on her in silence and with a terrible expression, cast her to the ground and proceeded to beat and pinch her till she was nearly senseless, after which her tormentor disappeared. Having experienced this treatment several times, the poor woman finally abstained altogether from leaving the house, unless she was protected by a servant or a companion. And this precaution she observed for several years, during which time she never was molested. So, at last, she began to believe that the spell was broken and that her strange enemy had departed forever. In consequence, she grew less careful about the usual precaution and one day stepped down alone to a little stream that ran by the house for to wash some clothes. Stooping down over her work, she never thought of any danger and began to sing as she used to do in the light-hearted days before the spell was upon her, when suddenly a dark shadow fell across the water, and looking up, she beheld to her horror the strange woman on the opposite side of the little stream, with her terrible eyes intently fixed on her, as hard and still as if she were of stone. Springing up with a scream of terror, she flung down her work and ran towards the house. But soon she heard footsteps behind her, and in an instant she was seized, thrown down to the ground, and her tormentor began to beat her even worse than before, till finally she lost all consciousness. And in this state she was found by her husband, lying on her face and speechless. She was at once carried to the house, and all the care that affection and rural skill could bestow were lavished on her, but in vain. She, however, regained sufficient consciousness to tell them of the terrible encounter she had gone through, but died before the night had passed away. There is a fort in a townland near Ballinasloe. A young man from this district was coming home one night and heard music playing from inside the fort. He was fond of dancing and, unable to resist the temptation, started dancing to the fairies' music. A woman came from the fort, stood before him, and started dancing with him. She kept him dancing without pause until cock-crow next morning. When he went home in the morning, he fell sick and died. In the parish of Garton there lived a man called Ned Ward. He opened a quarry in the hill close to his house and began work with a considerable number of men helping him. That first day, a little fairy visited Ward and demanded that he leave the quarry at once, or they would all suffer if they disobeyed him. The men would not give in, but instead ignored the warning and continued working all that day. The fairy's revenge came swift. When Ned Ward went home that night, he found his previously healthy daughter dumb, and she remained so for life. The strange thing was, though, that whenever the people of the house lost anything, all they had to do was ask this girl, and she could walk directly to the spot where it was. When the fairies took the gift of speech from this child, they gave her another one instead. She lived to be about 28 years of age. I was up in bed and, I suppose, asleep, and I dreamt that the boy James came to my bedside and woke me up by saying, "How many lights does death put up?" And in the dream there appeared such light as I never saw in my life. And when I woke up, another light like it was in the room. Within 3 months afterwards, we buried 2 granddaughters out of this house. This was 4 years ago, and for 3 mornings, one after another, there was a robin at our cellar door before the deaths. I had an encounter about 2 years ago, I'd say. I live in a very rural area and my closest neighbour is around a quarter of a mile away from me. Well, I was taking my dog outside and I usually stand on the porch and watch him to make sure he doesn't take off exploring. But it was summer and it was dark out, probably around 10 p.m. or later maybe, and a huge glowing thing flew right by my face. Then it happened again, but this time it was like everything was in slow motion and I could see its little body and face. I thought maybe I was going crazy, but I know what I saw. I've always heard that they only let you see them if they want to be seen. Well, my granny has taught me to leave milk and cake out for them since I was young, so I figured maybe that's their way of saying thanks. It was a special moment that I'll always remember, and when I have children, I'll teach them to do the same for the Fae, to let them know that we mean no harm and that we know this was their land first. I knew a man 3 or 4 years ago whom they struck down with paralysis. Their sight is so penetrating that I think they could see through the earth. They have a silvery voice, quick and sweet, and the music they play is most beautiful. They take the whole body and soul of young and intellectual people who are interesting, transmuting the body to a body like their own. I asked them once if they ever died, and they said, "No, we are always always kept coming. Once they take you and you taste food in their place, you cannot come back. You are changed to one of them and will live with them forever. They are able to appear in different forms. One once appeared to me and seemed only 4 feet high and stoutly built, and he said to me, "I am bigger than I appear to you now. We can make the old young, the big small, the small big." And one of their women told all the secrets of my family. She said that my brother in Australia would travel much and suffer hardships, all of which came true, and foretold that my nephew, then about 2 years old, would become a great clergyman in America, and that is what he is now. There was a boy in this district named John who was once taken by the fairies. He came from a large and decent farming family. One day, 4 years after his disappearance, 2 of his brothers were passing by a thorn bush not far from their house when they heard a sudden and strange crack that startled them. They took to their heels immediately and ran straight home. That same day, their mother heard a footstep near the house, upon which she remarked to her daughter that if John, her lost son, had been at home, she would have sworn it was his footstep that she heard. Shortly after that day, John returned to the farm and told his family he had been with the fairies. He asked his brothers if they remembered the crack they heard from the thorn bush, and on receiving a reply that yes, they did, he went on to explain that it was one of the fairies he was with. He said the fairy was shooting an arrow at them, and that he, in trying to stop it, lifted a plate to intercept the arrow, and that was the strange cracking sound that they had heard. When questioned about the footstep his mother had heard, he said that it was his, and that he was near them all the time he had been away, but that he could not get to them. In fact, he said, he saw all they were doing, and as an instance of this, he described in detail the day on which they had taken corn to town, and offered much information about their trip. John could give no account of how he had been taken, or how he had been let loose by the fairies, merely remarking that he seemed as if he had been unconscious and then woke up in this world and at once came back to his own people. In the year before the Great Rebellion, 2 young men from Newcastle were sporting on the high moors above Elsdon, and, after pursuing their game several hours, sat down to dine in a green glen near one of the mountain streams. After their rest, the younger lad ran to the brook for water, and, after stooping to drink, was surprised on lifting his head again by the appearance of a brown dwarf who stood on a crag covered with brackens across the burn. This extraordinary personage did not appear to be above half the stature of a common man, but was uncommonly stout and broad-built, having the appearance of vast strength. His dress was entirely brown, the colour of the brackens, and his head covered with frizzled red hair. His countenance was expressive of the most savage ferocity, and his eyes glared like a bull. It seems he addressed the young man, first threatening him with his vengeance for having trespassed on his lands, and asking him if he knew in whose presence he stood. The youth replied that he supposed him to be the lord of the moors, that he had offended through ignorance, and offered to bring him the game he had killed. The dwarf was a little mollified by this submission, but remarked that nothing could be more offensive to him than such an offer, as he considered the wild animals as his subjects, and never failed to avenge their destruction. He condescended further to inform him that he was, like himself, mortal, though of years far exceeding the lot of common humanity. He never, he added, fed on anything that had life, but lived in the summer on whortleberries, and in winter on nuts and apples, of which he had great store in the woods. Finally, he invited his new acquaintance to accompany him home and partake of his hospitality, an offer which the young man was on the point of accepting, and was just going to spring across the brook, which, if he had done, the dwarf would certainly have torn him to pieces, when his foot was arrested by the voice of his companion, who thought he had tarried too long, and on looking around again, the wee brown man was fled, he said. The story adds that he was imprudent enough to slight the encounter and to sport over the moors on his way homewards. But soon after his return, he fell into a lingering disorder and died within the year. Within the last 60 years, there lived in our midst a comely old Irish lady who firmly believed in the fairies. Her name was Molly Casey, and she lived alone in her little mud-walled cabin, which was well known in the district. Before she would retire to bed every night, she placed on the table food for all her dead friends. She also set a blazing fire and a lighted candle, all for the accommodation of what we call the good people. Molly would lay awake all during the night waiting for the company to arrive. She would then, from her bed, call them by their names to instruct them about the regulation of the table and the taking of their meals. On the night of Molly Casey's death, as the wake was in progress, a white horse, unknown in the district, was seen passing slowly by her house. The belief of the people was that it was the fairies, or good people, who were attending the wake. A man was returning one night from a funeral. The moon was shining bright, and from the other side of the river came the sounds of merriment and the notes of a bagpipe. Taking off his shoes, he waded across the river, and there he found a great crowd of people dancing on the inch or the bank on the other side. He mingled with them without being observed, and he longed to join in the dance, for he had no mean opinion of his own skill. Then he did so, but found that it was not to be compared to theirs. They were so light and agile. He was going away then, quiet in despair, when a little old man who was looking on with marks of displeasure in his face came up to him and, telling him he was his friend and his father's friend, bade him go into the ring and call for a lilt. He complied, and all were amazed at his dancing. He then got a table and danced on it, and finally he span round and round on a trencher. When he was done, they wanted him to dance again and again, but he refused with a great oath, and instantly he found himself lying on the inch with only a white cow grazing beside him. On going home, he got a shivering upon him and a fever. He was for many days out of his mind, and recovery was slow. But ever after, he had great skill in fairy matters. In this region, there are two kinds of pixies. One purely a land-dwelling pixie, and the other a pixie who dwells on the sea strand between high and low watermark. The land-dwelling pixie was usually thought to be full of mischievous fun, but it never did any harm. Now, there was a very prevalent belief when I was a boy that the sea strand pixie called Booker had to be given 3 fish to ensure that the fishermen got a good catch of fish themselves. Now, the land pixie was supposed to be able to render its devotees invisible if they only anointed their eyes with a certain green salve made of secret herbs gathered from Kerris Moor. In the invisible condition thus induced, people were able to join the pixie revels, during which, according to the old tradition, time slipped away very, very rapidly, though people returned from the pixies no older than when they went with them. There was a neighbour of mine who was coming home from a fair in his cart. It was dark, but not very late. There was a fort sitting close by the road that he was travelling. All was quiet as he was passing by the fort, but once he had passed it, a horde of fairies came out and rushed at the cart. The ass pulling the cart froze and could not be moved. Some of the fairy climbed into the cart, and the man tried desperately to pull them out of it. Other fairies were pulling hard on the cart, trying to pull the cart and ass toward the graveyard. The ass resisted the pull and moved forward on the road, at which the fairies fell away and were not seen again. The man died 3 days later and was buried in that very graveyard. In Firm Fort in Kerry, there grew a beautiful apple tree, and Mrs. Fairlie one day picked some of these apples as she was passing. Why she did this, I do not know, as this fort was well known to be a fairy fort. Well, when she was walking home, she saw a group of crows flying all around her. So she threw an apple at them, and one carried it away. The rest continued flying around and around her, so she then threw another, and another, and then all of the apples, and the crows took them all back again to the fort. The crows, they say, were the fairies. I worked for several years as a guide on an historic silver mine tour during its annual 100-day season, and I worked one off-season as a miner in a gold mine, and then the following summer was a tour guide there. I also spent several months working on a mine closing project, And this was all in Colorado in the 1990s. In my life, I've had many experiences with ghosts and the little people, and even a few entities that I don't know how to label, but these are my experiences with the Tommyknockers. Tommyknockers are entities who live underground, who can and do interact with humans who are also underground. Sometimes they are seen. Belief in them is widespread, and they're known by many names in many places. Calling them knockers or Tommyknockers comes from the miners in Cornwall and is the name generally used by hard rock miners in North America because of the many Cornish miners who worked here in the 1800s. One day at the gold mine, I was telling a tour group about the Tommyknockers, and a lady who was from the Czech Republic spoke up and said that they had such beings in her old country. She called them the Permannic. A week or so later at the silver mine, there was another lady from the Czech Republic on the tour, and when I got to the part about the Tommyknockers, I stopped and asked her if she knew about the Permannic. The question surprised her, but she admitted that she did. So I asked her to please tell the group about them. And this she did, and what she said was almost word for word what I normally told groups about the Tommyknockers. Like most of the little people, the Tommyknockers can be anything from friendly and helpful to malicious and vindictive. According to the law, they might knock on the rock or timbers to warn a miner of danger. And seriously, rock and timber noise can be a sign of danger. Or they might blow out his candle, back in the days when they worked by candlelight. There are stories of them leading lost miners to safety after they lost their lights, and even of them leading the miners to richer ore. But on the other hand, they might also put out a miner's light maliciously, then dump his lunch, hide his tools, trip him over, or drop the tools down a shaft. Because of this, many miners had a habit of leaving a bit of food or tobacco out for them, and some mines even had carved images of Tommyknockers at the portals for the miners to touch for good luck going in or in thanks when coming out safely. Such heathen practices were undoubtedly preached against on Sunday morning, but then again, the preacher wasn't the one going underground into the Tommyknockers' territory the other 6 days of the week. There are many fairy forts in our district. In Rossdale there is a square fort surrounded by blackthorn bushes. One day, Owen Griffin went to cut one of these bushes to put in a gap of a fence. He first cut the hanging branches and then started to cut the tree when suddenly the hatchet he was holding was fiercely taken out of his hand and he never saw it again. Many say they have seen the small people here by the hundreds. In Ireland, they call the small people the fairies. My mother believes there were such things, and so did the old folks in these parts. My grandmother used to put down a good furze fire for them on stormy nights because, as she said, they are a sort of people wandering around the world with no home or habitation, and they ought to be given a little comfort, she would say. The most fear of them was that they might come at night and change a baby for one that was no good. My mother said that Joan Nicholas believed the fairies had changed her baby because it was very small and cross-tempered. Up on the hill, you'll see a round ring with grass greener than anywhere else, and that is where the small people used to dance. I went out foraging for mushrooms alone one late afternoon over the summer out around the Bay Area, and a friend's elderly mother warned me to stay on the dirt road because the fairies would be out that time of day. Well, I wandered off the road a little bit, following this trail of old fence posts, and before I knew it, I had gone pretty far into the woods. It was dead quiet, and it was getting dark. Suddenly, I heard bells ringing far off in the trees. My skin started to crawl, so I called out in the direction of the trees, "Thanks for the mushrooms. I really like your forest." And I tore back down the fence line to the road and pretty much sprinted back to my friend's house like a lunatic. Fairies. Oh man. There was an old and poor man who died in County Donegal. Only 2 men turned up to his wake. The 2 men were sitting quietly at the wake, paying their respects, when around midnight there came a fairy blast right in through the door. Every candle lit around the corpse was blown out, and for what they felt was about 5 minutes, the men sat in silence and were unable to move. Then the candles lit up again, and the corpse and the coffin were gone. The men later told that the deceased man had wished to be buried in a special place, but that his grave had been prepared somewhere else. They wondered if this was why he had been taken by the fairies. The man's coffin and corpse were never seen or heard of afterwards. I was a young child when it happened, around 6 years old. My grandmother's old boss had let her stay at his cabin. It was either in far northern Minnesota or in Wisconsin somewhere, and she invited us to come and stay with her. I remember it was in a very secluded area, heavy woods and forest. After we got all settled in, my mum and grandma started making lunch, so they gave my brothers and I the okay to go and explore for a bit. And I remember watching my brothers run off in one direction, so I decided to go in the opposite direction. After a while of exploring, I came upon this really pretty river and small waterfall-esque area. After just staring at it for a while, I sat on the side of it and dipped my legs into the water and just started chucking tiny rocks into the water. Well, after a few minutes, I saw movement by the waterfall part of the river and saw there a pretty woman with long, damp white hair. Her skin seemed off-coloured, and her arms and legs had these weird frilly things on them, and she was also nude, but little me didn't really think twice about it, or really think it was odd. Once she noticed I had seen her, she slid into the water and disappeared, only for a few moments later to appear in the middle of the river closer to my side. And she just stared at me before letting out a melodic laugh and then started singing. I remember the whole forest going completely silent, and my entire attention was on her and the beautiful singing, this melodic sound coming from her. Before I knew it, I had walked into the water towards her, but due to being a kid and not being very good at swimming, The speed of the river left me struggling and panicking as I started to be pulled under. Not by the woman, but just by the movement and the speed of the water. I remember being completely underwater and struggling to get afloat. And then things going black. I woke up on the shore side of the water with her looking over me. She had a sad expression on her face, and then I heard my brothers shouting for me, which made her quickly hop in the water and disappear. I eventually stood up and ran to my brothers and tried telling them what had happened, but they didn't believe me and just thought that I'd hit my head and fallen into the river. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt, as I clearly remember her stroking my face and bringing me back to the shore after nearly drowning. Even to this day, my family makes fun of me and calls me the mermaid lover and stuff like that. But I know what I saw, and I truly believe it was some kind of water lady, be it a nymph or water spirit, but I think whatever the lady was, she had only meant to entertain and play with me, but then wound up saving my life. Many people were frightened at night when they passed by a particular fort on my uncle's farm. One time, a man named Patrick Comr was coming home from Meerlik, where he had been visiting, to Kilmore, where his own house was. He came across my uncle's fields, and as he came near the fort, he stood looking around himself because the night was bright and he wanted to take a good look at that fort. He could see many things, he said, until suddenly a great darkness came over the place and he was unable to see a thing. He couldn't even see where he was walking. Not knowing what else to do, he let out a loud roar, and suddenly the darkness lifted and he was surrounded by great brightness. When Comr looked around himself, he saw a fairy only feet away staring at him. He got afraid then and he started walking very quickly towards his house, but the fairy followed close behind him, walking just as quick. When Comr opened his door to enter the house, the fairy was standing at the door right behind him. Comr told the fairy to come into his house, but the fairy said, "No, I will be going." I used to hear about a Zeno Girl who came to Newlyn as nurse to the child of a gentleman living at Zimmerman Cot. The gentleman warned her never to touch a box of ointment which he guarded in a special room, nor even to just enter that room. But one day, in his absence, she entered the room and took some of the ointment. Suspecting the qualities of the ointment, she put it on her eyes with the wish that she might see where her master was. She immediately found herself in the higher part of the orchard amongst the Pixies, where they were having such junketing, meaning festivity and dancing, and there saw the gentleman whose child she had nursed. For a time she managed to evade him, but before the junketing was at an end, he discovered her and requested her to go home, and then, to her intense astonishment, she learned that she had been away 20 years, though she was unchanged. The gentleman scolded her for having touched the ointment, paid her wages in full and sent her back to her people. It said that she always had one regret, and that was that she hadn't gone into the forbidden room earlier. One day, when I was in Cumberland, I set off late in the evening, and after a time I lost myself among the mountains. At last, as it grew dark, I found myself in a gloomy ravine between very high rocks, which round and round about as though there was no end to it. I heard nothing but the ravens croaking among the crags above me. They did not know that I understood them, so they talked about me freely, and what they all said was, "Look at that foolish fellow. He little knows where he's going. Tomorrow we'll eat his eyes, and then we'll pick his bones." And then they set up a kind of hoarse, horrid, grating laugh among themselves. However, I was determined to go on, hoping to meet with some strange adventure. Indeed, it would have been no use turning back, for I had quite lost my way, and it was getting pitch dark. So on I walked, and kept stumbling over large stones that lay in my way. After a time, I fancied I heard in front of me the sound of someone whistling, and sometimes singing at the pitch of his voice in harsh, shrill tones. But it was too dark for me to see anyone. The sound seemed to go on as I went on. Indeed, the person who uttered them seemed to be travelling very fast, for I had much difficulty in keeping within hearing of his voice. At last the moon appeared, and I perceived about 100 yards in front of me a most extraordinary figure. It was that of a man about 4 feet high, dressed in brown, who went springing from rock to rock with wonderful activity, singing or whistling all the time. I shouted after him, but he paid no attention to me. Determined to get to him, I ran forward as fast as I could, and when I got near enough, threw a large stone at him and hit him on the head. He uttered a tremendous yell and turned around, roaring at me, full of fury. His face was as brown as earth and looked 100 years old, but he must have been wonderfully strong, for he heaved from the ground a huge stone, far bigger than I could have lifted, raising it above his head in his long arms, as if he meant to throw it at me. And then so he did, but I slipped out of the way. He then rushed at me with a loud roar, seized me in his long arms, and would have dashed me against the rocks in a moment. But I had long heard of the brown men of the moors and mountains, though I had never met with one before, and a very wise old woman had once told me of a charm by means of which they might be appeased when angry. The charm was this: to put one's mouth near the brown man's ear and say, "Mungo tickle snow out towel Dixie Grambo." This I did, and all at once he put me down and looked at me with wondering eyes. In Lawrence Ryan's garden in Turla, there is an old fort. One night, Thomas Quinn and his father were bringing their cattle to a fair in Williamstown for to sell the next morning. As they were passing Ryan's, the gate to his garden was open. The cattle suddenly moved toward the gate, intent on entering, but as the cattle approached, the gate closed itself from the inside. No one was seen, but the fort was just inside the gate. About 30 years ago, said the old man, there lived in a village near Rahanain Castle a man named James Kevane, a stepbrother of my own, and he married a woman called Elizabeth Shea. Now 3 or 4 nights after her second child was born, Kevane's wife, who was attended by her own mother and her mother-in-law, woke and saw the bed on fire. She called to the mother, who was there at the bedside but had fallen asleep. The mother sprang up and, turning towards the hearth, saw a cat with the face of a man on her, and was much frightened, but she had no time to look longer at the cat. When she had the fire quenched, she looked for the cat, but not a trace of her could they find in the house, and they never caught a sight of her again. 2 days later, the young child died, and 3 or 4 days after that, the woman had a terrible pain in her foot. It swelled to a great size, and where the swelling was, the skin looked like the bark of a tree. The poor woman suffered terribly. They sent for the priest many times and spent money for masses. They offered one priest £20 to cure her, but he said that if all the money in the kingdom were offered, he would have nothing to do with the case. He was afraid, you see, of getting a fairy stroke himself. The foot was swelling always, and it was that size that a yard of linen was needed to go once around it. The poor woman was 1.5 years in this way, and towards the end she said that horses and carriages were moving around the house every night. The mother went to an old woman, a herb doctor, and begged her to come and cure her daughter if she could. "I can cure her," said the woman, "but if I do, you must let some other one of your family go in place of her." Now, as all the sons and daughters were married and had families of their own, the mother said she had no one she could put in place of this daughter. Kevane's wife used to raise herself up by a rope which was put hanging above the bed. Then, when she was tired and she could hold it no longer, she would lie down again. This woman remained in suffering like this till a week before she died. She told her friends that it was no use to give her remedies or pay money for masses to benefit her, that it wasn't herself that was in it at all. You see, on the night that the mother saw the cat with a man's face and she sitting on the hearth, Kevane's real wife was taken by the fairies and put in Rahanain Castle to nurse a young child. Nobody could tell who the sick woman was, but whoever she was, she died, and the body was so swollen and drawn up that the coffin was like a great box, as broad as 'twas long. About a year after the funeral, Pat Mahoney, who worked for a hotel keeper in Dingle, went to a fair in Listowel. At the fair, a strange man came up to Mahoney. "Where do you live?" asked the man. "In Dingle," said Pat Mahoney. "Do you know families named Shay and Kevane?" "I do," said Mahoney. "Kevane's wife died about 12 months ago." "Well," said the strange man, "I have a message for you to the parents of that woman, Elizabeth Shay. She is coming to my house for the last 9 months. She comes always after sunset. She lives in a fairy fort that is on my land." This is how we discovered the woman about 9 months ago. Potatoes and milk were put out on the dresser for one of my servants who was away from home, and before the man came, this woman was seen going to the dresser and eating the potatoes and drinking the milk. She came every evening after that for about a month before I had the courage to speak to her. When I spoke, she told me that her father, mother, husband and child were living near Rahanane Castle. She gave every right token of who she was. "I spent," said she, 3 months in Rahanane, at first nursing a child that was in it, but was taken after that to the fort on the place where I am living now in Lismore. I have not tasted food in the fort yet," said she, "but at the end of 7 years I'll be forced to eat and drink unless somebody saves me. I cannot escape unassisted." When Mahoney came home to Dingle, he went straight to tell the woman's friends all that the strange man had told him. She had told the man, too, how her friends must come with 4 men and a horse and car, and that she would meet them. Mrs. Kevane's father and brother and I and another neighbouring man offered to go to Lismore, but Kevane wouldn't go, for he had a second wife by this time. The following morning we started out and went to the parish priest to take his advice. He told us not to go and advised us in every way to stay at home. He was afraid, I suppose, that the woman might give the people too much knowledge of the other world. The other 3 men were stopped by the priest, and sure there was no use in me going alone, so I didn't. You know, Kevane's wife knew that her husband was married for a second time, for she sent word to him that she didn't care, that she would live with her father and her child. But then everybody forgot the whole affair for a couple of years. Then one day a retired policeman named O'Connor was going from Lismore to Dingle, and the woman appeared before him, saluted him, and asked was he going to Dingle. Well, he said he was. She told him then that if he wanted to do her any good or service, to go to her friends, and she gave him their names, and tell them that they had plenty of time yet to go and claim her, that she had not eaten fairy food so far. He promised to do as she asked. He reached Dingle soon after and told her friends what she had said. O'Connor, however, said he wouldn't tell them everything in full until they would promise to go. At this, the relations of Kevane's second wife went to O'Connor and bribed him to say nothing more. After that, he was silent, and once again people cared no more about the woman. The 7 years passed, and at the end of that time, Elizabeth Shay's father saw her one evening when he was coming home from market and was about a mile beyond Dingle. She walked almost a mile with him, but never said a word. At parting, she gave him a blow on the face, and on the following day he had to take to his bed and was blind for 7 or 8 years. He kept to his bed most of the time until he died. During the couple of days before he lost his sight, Shay saw the daughter come in and give a blow to her child, which died strangely soon after. Neither priest nor doctor could tell what ailment had been on the child. And about the time that the child died, Shay's second wife got sick and has not milked a cow nor swept the house since. She has not gone to mass or market these 20 years. She keeps the bed now and will keep it while she lives. She has no pain and is not suffering in any way, but is dead in herself, as it were. She had a fine young girl of a daughter, but she too got a blow and died 2 days after. She has 3 sons too, but Elizabeth Shay has never done them any harm. There was a foolish woman living in Hodgestown, County Westmeath. She was out in the fields one day and came across a banshee. She boldly walked toward the banshee and could see that she was combing her hair. When the banshee saw her, it disappeared and left the comb behind. The woman was keen to get a hold of it. She picked it up and took it home with her. The banshee came knocking at the woman's window every night for 3 nights looking for her comb. A neighbour told the foolish woman to give back the comb to the banshee, but to be careful not to hand it to her. The 3rd night, when the banshee came to the window, the woman carefully took the comb in the metal tongs, reached the tongs out the window and gave it to her. The banshee took the comb and broke the tongs in 2 halves. Many years ago, a girl who lived near Netherwhitton was returning from milking with her pail on her head when she saw fairies playing in the fields, and though she pointed them out to her companions, they couldn't see them. The reason, it seemed, was her pad for bearing the pail on her head was composed of 4-leaf clovers, which gives the power of seeing fairies. Also, a few miles from Alnwick is a fairy ring, round which if people run more than 9 times, some evil will befall them. The children constantly run this number 9 times around the ring, but nothing will induce them to venture a 10th run. Up on Seaview Green there are 2 rings where the Pixies used to dance and play music on a moonlight night. I've heard that they would come there from the moors. Little people, they are called. And if you keep quiet when they are dancing, you'll see them. But if you make any noise, they'll disappear. My grandmother, Nancy Madden, was down on Seaview Green by moonlight and saw the Pixies dancing and passed right near them. She said they were like little children and wore red cloaks. In 1990, an elderly woman sat down and shared a shocking experience from her childhood. She had talked about it before, of course, but this was the first time she allowed another to record it and share it beyond her family. In 1900, she was a young girl of 7 or 8 and lived with her family in western New South Wales. One night, the girl and her sisters went out to a local billabong, which is a small body of water in the Australian bushland, and there the 3 of them slept under the stars. The girl was nestled between her 2 older sisters and, at least initially, slept soundly. She was woken suddenly to realise there were many hands upon her, pulling her up from the ground and trying to hoist her into their arms. Her sisters woke at the struggle and screamed as they watched a group of dwarf-sized, humanoid-looking creatures running away, carrying their crying sister until they disappeared out of sight. The girls ran back to their house and, between fits of sobbing and screaming, reported what had happened. Within an hour, a large group of adults were assembled and began searching the bush for the young girl. The searchers looked in caves, up trees, nearby farmhouses and roads, all the wrong places. You see, the creatures had taken the girl the one place they never considered: underground. After they had the girl out of sight, the dwarfish creatures took her to a cavern under the ground, then covered her in animal fat. She distinctly recalled the touch of their skin on hers and described their skin as leathery. Her eyes were caked in the foul, fatty substance, which kept her from seeing her captors, but not from smelling and hearing them. They smelled of the same sickly fat, and she supposed that they were covered in it too. And the noise, the sounds they made, terrified her more than anything. They communicated in guttural noises, deep grunts and rumbles from their throat. They left her alone in a small space, seemingly content that she could not escape. Above ground, the search continued. 1 hour turned to 2, and 2 hours turned to 3. All the while, the girl could hear the voices of the searchers above her subterranean prison. They walked above her, calling out her name, but couldn't hear her muffled cries. In desperation, the girl began clawing at the tree roots above her, until finally her bloodied fingers broke through the ground. She thrust her little arm out of the underground chamber and waved it around, praying it would be seen. And it was, only the young man who had seen it ran away in terror, thinking the arm bursting through the ground was something evil. Well, thankfully he regained his composure and told the girl's family what he had seen. When they arrived at the base of the tree and saw the little girl's arm sticking out from the roots, the family fell to their knees and began digging her out with their hands. Eventually, they made a hole big enough for her to squeeze through, but the furious creatures were not going to give her up. They grabbed onto her and pulled as hard as they could. Meanwhile, the family above ground did the same, and although she was covered in the slippery fat, they managed to outmuscle the subterranean creatures, and they pulled the little girl free. The bizarre tug of war was over, but the family were not yet content. They lit a fire in and around the hole through which she was dragged, stood back, and watched it burn. The bodies of the underground creatures were not found among the ashes of the fire or in the cavern, and the family never saw them again. My grandfather was a hard-working, industrious, and thrifty farmer. I often heard my father say that the beautiful white thorn hedges that separate our fields were planted by my grandfather when my father was just a little boy. At both ends of each hedge, he planted a white thorn about 2 feet high. These established and grew really quickly, and grandfather was very attentive to them. In his walks of an evening, he would pull the grass from around them, and when any of the fields were being tilled, he threw a couple of forks of manure round these white thorns. Well, time rolled by as it does. All the hedges grew, but each white thorn at the end made great growth. They grew practically to be trees rather than bushes. So the time came for the hedges to be cut, branched and thickened. Grandfather alone did this so carefully. He never touched with saw or axe the valued whitethorn tree at each end. To him, these individual whitethorn trees were sacred. He said they were shelters for the Banshee. The years rolled by and my grandfather got old and retired from work. In fact, he lived to the age of 89, hale and hearty, and died without sickness. Always a spiritual life seemed to guide him, and he certainly had an unshaken belief in the Banshee and the fairies. The time came for the hedges to be cut after his passing, and this my father and a workman did, and they did it in a modern style. They spared nothing. They had no beliefs in Banshee or the fairies, and they just slashed and cut the large whitethorn trees at the end, just as they cut the hedges. During the following nights, my father and others heard the sad wail and cry of the Banshee. No deaths followed, and it was believed she was mourning the loss of her whitethorn shelter, which had been slashed and cut away. Near St. Just, on Christmas Day, a Pixies carried away in his cloak a boy, but the boy got home again. Then the Pixies took him a second time, and again the boy got home. Each time he was taken, he was only away for an hour, and he seemed to be in a trance state. Gudrun lived there with her husband, whose name was Christian, and they had many children, but their youngest son's name was also Christian, and he was 4 years old when this happened. It was in the spring, and the kids were playing beneath some crags that were there, just above the home field. And it was a peculiar crag. They said it looked like a church. Well, they were all playing there. She, of course, was at home, the woman, doing her chores, and wasn't thinking about the youngest boy at all. She thought for sure that he was with the children playing there, but when they came home, the boy wasn't with them. And then, of course, they dashed off and everyone started looking for the child, but they didn't find him anywhere. And there was no hazard that they could imagine that he had found, or neither brooks or anything that he could have fallen into. So they searched until evening, and still the boy wasn't found. And everyone, naturally, was chilled by fear and sorrow. And the mother, well, she didn't sleep at all that night. And then, next morning, they started searching again, and still young Christian wasn't found. But in the evening, when it started getting dark, Gudrun walked to the cookhouse, or the pantry, and saw there the child standing behind the door, tear-stained, weak and downhearted. And when they started pressing him to say what had happened, he said, "A woman took me, but I cried so much that she didn't want to keep me any longer." No one knows to this day where the child was during this time, but everyone thought that he had been with the elves in the crags. Well, I was sitting on a blanket in a field, and it flitted around me for about half a minute, I'd say. Then it flew away. It wasn't a great time in my life then, but I can't say that the encounter scared me in any way. I was pretty numb and shut off, even to myself at that time. It mostly made me curious and sort of got my attention. Anyway, it never even occurred to me that it could have been a fairy. But one day I was talking to this old man I know. He's a Kentucky backwoods old man who knows everything about nature. And I told him about this strangest insect that I'd ever seen. Without hesitation, he said, "Oh, you saw a fairy." I couldn't believe that he believed in such a thing, but he said it without any doubt, so I accepted it without any questions. Whether I believe in fairies or not, what I saw is what people who do believe call fairies. A boy told me last night of 2 men that went with Pochine to the island of Arran, and when they were on the shore, they saw a ship coming as if to land, and they said, "We'll have the bottle ready for those that are coming." But when the ship came close to land, it vanished, and presently they got their boat ready and put out to sea. And a sudden blast came and swept one of them off, and the other saw him come up again and put out the oar across his breast for him to take hold of it. But he would not take it and said, "I'm all right again now," and sank down again and was never seen no more. The Pixies and fairies are little beings in the human form existing on the astral plane who may be in the process of evolution, and, as such, I believe that people have seen them. The astral plane is not known to us now because our psychic faculty of perception has faded out by non-use, and this condition has been brought about by an almost exclusive development of the physical brain. But it is likely that the psychic faculty will develop again in its turn. It is my point of view that there is a basis of truth in the folklore, with its remnants of occult learning, magic, charms, and the like. Folklore seems to be the remains of forgotten psychical facts rather than history, as it is often called. My parents' neighbour is 94, and he is some man for the stories. My mother calls into him daily and helps out with a few errands, and she will sit with him and keep him company, as he might not see anyone else until she calls again. One story he told my mum was about fairies, and since she's told me, I've become a little more curious about it myself. So, when he moved to the area with his family, just as a child, he and his siblings were warned to stay out of a certain field. They were told that that was where the fairies lived. And so he did as he was told and never entered that field himself. However, one day a young girl in the district went missing. Now, people searched for her day and night, but there was no sign of her. 2 days later, she just turned up. She was different though. She looked a little different. That is, her face had changed a little, but it was her. She told them that the fairies had taken her, though she couldn't say where. But she never seemed to be the same girl afterwards. A few years ago now, out on the Erin Road where the minister had his house, there were fairies, and every night they would come out and play around a certain bunch of trees. One early morning, the minister was passing by these trees and stopped to look at the fairies. Another fairy approached the man and asked him what he was looking at. The minister told him that he was just admiring the small fairies' dresses. The bigger fairy was ill-pleased with this and told him, "Walk on and never bother about them." But the minister would not leave and instead continued to stand there watching the fairies. Then the fairy told him that he would now suffer under bad luck. At this, the minister turned and went back home to tell his wife about what had happened. Then he went about his day as usual. But that night he felt ill and soon after died. His wife believes that if he had walked on when the fairy told him, her husband would be living now to this day. This happened in around 1991 or 92, near Banshee in Cork. This German man came over to Cork to recover from something or another. It was some sort of upset anyway he was trying to recuperate from. Why he chose Cork, I do not know, but he did. He was young, I'd say. I'd put him in his early 20s, much the same as me at the time. So he rented the little cottage down the way from my farm, some ways outside of Banshee town. I saw him most days, taking walks, and we would pass the time. You know how it is. He was friendly enough, a little standoffish, but it didn't bother me at all. He wasn't interested in taking in the tourist sites or anything like that, and he wasn't a drinking man, not least in town, but who knows what people do behind closed doors, and it's not for me to say. Well, he must have been here in the valley just a few weeks. I'd see him walking 2 or 3 times a day when I was out in my fields or even from the kitchen window. Then this one day, I see him rushing toward my house like a mad thing, and it must have been around dusk then. Something had a hold of him. He looked dishevelled, like he'd rolled down a long hill or something. His eyes were wide. He had scratches to his face and hands, and he was wet from the waist down. He came right up to me, up in my face, and started talking this gibberish. He kept grasping at my arms too and insisted that I stay with him. So I sat him down and I got him speaking English, and he said he had been out since morning walking. Walking and walking, he said. On the walk he did every day, but he couldn't stop and he couldn't find his way back. He was just walking around the same woodland path, through the creek, around a set of trees on that side of the creek. Then he'd find himself back at the creek. He'd walk through it to get to the other side, then around the same woodland path and back to the creek. He was lost, he said, and every time he thought he figured the way out, he found himself back at the creek. And he felt something telling him that his house was on the other side of the creek. So he crossed it, and so it went, over and over again. Every time he crossed the creek, he heard what he believed to be voices, but they were unclear. He thought there must be tourists nearby speaking a different language, but he could see no one. Just whispering and sometimes muffled laughter. The man was in torment and exhausted by the sight of him, and no wonder he'd been walking for hours and hours, so he said. Well, I gave it some thought and I asked him, "Did you go down near the old stone circle at all?" And he answered, yes, he did. He took a walk among them that morning. And I told him, I said, "You don't want to be going near those old stones. You're after upsetting the fae folk there." Well, of course, he had no idea of the other crowd, so I explained to him all I thought he need knowing and no more. Sure, the fella was scared enough as it was. "They've only put the stray on you," I said. "I've seen it plenty of times, happen to myself once or twice. They play tricks with your mind, get you lost and keep you lost. You can count yourself lucky they didn't drown you in that creek." Well, his face fell deathly pale. He nodded and said he had heard of such things at home in Germany. "But," he said, "I didn't hear them at the stones. I heard voices repeatedly at the creek, only at the creek," he said. "'Tis right," I told him. "That's where they wanted you, at the creek. They've given you a good old run around, I'd say." Well, the German fella insisted that I walk with him back to his little house. He packed his bags and left right then. I walked with him to the road to Banshee and stood waiting with him until a car pulled up and gave him a ride. Never saw that German again. Poor fella, got such a fright, but it's true, you know, what I said. He was lucky to get away with only a dose of the stray. It could have been worse, much worse. My granny was a real religious kind of woman, and she loved to try and scare me and my sister with stories of devils and demons and other evil things to make us be good and behave, but she always told this one story that just didn't fit the others. Funny thing is, I've never heard this story nowhere but from her, so thought it might do well to let others hear it. My granny used to swear up and down that there was some sort of devil or other nasty thing that could disguise itself as someone else. She said it wasn't too good at it though, and you could always tell something was off. Firstly, my granny said that whatever this thing was, it weren't human in the slightest. Wasn't some sort of witch or nothing, just something else entirely. She told me she didn't know what it really looked like neither, under that disguise and all. She told me that after her second husband died, about 2 weeks after the funeral, she got a knock at the door in the middle of the night in the dead of winter during a nasty snowstorm. She said she opened that door and there stood Hoyt, her second husband. She said at first she really thought it was him, but after he stepped into the light of the house, she knew something was off with him. She told me he looked sigoglin, which means built funny or crooked. I didn't know what that word meant back then though, so that sort of became the name of the thing. She said the first thing that was off about him were his eyes. They were just a touch too far apart. Not to any extreme degree, but just enough that it put her off. Then, she said, his skin was a hell of a lot smoother and less wrinkly than he was when he died. He was damn near 90, and she said he looked at least 10 years younger that night. She got real anxious-like when she started noticing all this stuff that didn't add up, and add to that the fact that she buried him 2 weeks before, and then she started panicking real hard. She said Hoyt reached up with both his hands and started telling her, "Don't worry, honey." But his voice wasn't right neither. She said it sounded like it hurt him to talk, like there was a groaning just behind his voice, and his lips didn't match up neither. She told my brother and me that it started to look more like someone put a bad mask of Hoyt and was wearing it around. She said she'd never been scared of her in her whole life. So she started pushing him and hitting on him with both her fists, and that woman was feisty as hell, so I'm sure she did some damage. And she said his skin was cold when his hands touched her. After she beat on him a little, the thing stepped back and started making noises she ain't ever heard before. She said it was like a low growl or a moan, and compared it to a heavy old door opening real slow like. She'd always try and make the noise herself, but get all choked up. Anyhow, she shut the door on the thing, and she said it just stood there for about an hour before it walked back into the woods. Now, she lived about 20 miles from any town, and her neighbours were all snowed in like her, so she couldn't call for help. Said she was the scariest she'd ever been that night. And she told us that the thing ain't always the same person, but can switch around and use new disguises when it wants to. She said that that's the only time she ever seen it herself, but had heard stories from her own mother about it. Funny thing is, about a month before she died, I went to the gas station on the way home from work real late, and when I got inside, there was a guy at the counter just standing there, all stiff-like. The cashier kept asking him to move so he could help me, but the fella wouldn't budge. Finally, the guy turned to me and I got a good look at his face. His skin was all rubbery and fake-looking, and I couldn't even really tell which way his eyes were facing, since they almost looked like two marbles, all dry and not wet like a normal eyeball. After I paid for my gas, the guy followed me out without saying as much as a word. It made me real uncomfortable, but at first I thought it was just someone who was down on their luck. So when I climbed back in my truck, I looked over to him and asked him if he needed help. He looked at me with those dry-looking eyes and said, "All good," with that same creaky voice my granny used to tell us about. Told her that story in the hospital the very next night, and she put her finger on my forehead and said, "Now you've seen it too." And I feel real strange about it. Maybe that guy at the gas station was the Sigoglin, like my granny said, but who knows? I knew of a herd's house where 5 or 6 herds went one after another, and every one of them died, and their dogs and their cow. And the gentleman that owned the place came to ask another man to go into it, but his wife said she wouldn't go, for there was some bad luck about it, she said. But she did go after, and she was a very clean woman, not like some that do keep their house dirty. Well, one day a woman came to the door and asked for a dish of oaten meal, and she took it from the shelf and gave it to her. "I'll bring it back to you tomorrow," the strange woman said. "It'll be easy getting it then when it's market day." "Do not," said the woman of the house, "for if you do, I won't take it." "Well," the stranger said, "you'll have luck after this. Only one thing I will tell you. Keep that door at the back shut, and if you want any opening there, let you open the window." Well, so she did, and by minding that rule and keeping the house so clean, she was never troubled by them and lived there all her life. My dad's family come from a small ranch in Mexico. This ranch is really small, so small that basically all my family lives there. Usually, if you live in that ranch, you're related. There's probably only 4 or 5 families that are not related to us. So the ranch is small and, well, it's very dry. It has dirt roads and so on. Now, once my uncles were getting ready for a party. They were young at that time, maybe their early 20s, and the party they were going to was on another ranch. So it was a little far away. My uncles, being party people, they would take their horses and they'd go to the party. Sometimes they would come back very late. Actually, that was usually the case. So they got ready and started heading to the party. It happened to be a very dark night, but they didn't care. They got to the party and one of my uncles, Steve, saw these 2 girls away in the corner. Well, he saw them and he said that they were very beautiful. They had light-coloured hair and light skin. And being in Mexico, it was really rare to see a girl like that. So Steve then elbowed my other uncle Andrew and they walked up to the girls and started dancing. After a few dances, they'd had a really good time and decided to head home. They said bye to these girls and took off on their horses. So they were riding their horses for about 30 minutes when they saw the same 2 blonde girls walking down the dirt road. They stopped and got off their horses and walked towards the girls, thinking that they might have wanted a ride home. My uncle then heard one single laugh, and in front of his eyes, they disappeared into the darkness. So they both got back on their horses and continued on home. They later came across another single laughing sound. My uncle Steve got off his horse and asked who was there. Yeah, I know it seems stupid now, but my uncle really didn't care about getting hurt. Then Steve saw 2 birds. He said they were really big birds and as dark as the night sky. And the 2 birds were laughing at him. Andrew then got off his horse and walked towards Steve at this point. Both of them looked at these laughing birds, confused. Then one of the birds speaks and said, "We enjoy dancing with you boys." My uncle Steve really didn't enjoy the fact that he had danced with a witch, so he took out his gun and started shooting at the birds. He always carried a gun with him, by the way. The birds just flew around and laughed at him some more, so Steve started swearing at them. Well, it seems they didn't appreciate that, and one of them flew down and clawed at his face. It scratched his face right up. The birds then flew off, thanking Steve for the dance and actually saying his name. Neither of my uncles had given the girls their names that night. There is no luck if you meet a mermaid and you out at sea, but storms will come, or some ill will happen. There was a ship on the way to America, and a mermaid was seen following it, and the bad weather began to come. And the captain said, "It must be some man in the ship she's following, and if we knew which one it was, we'd put him out to her and save ourselves. So they drew lots, and the lot fell on one man. And then the captain was sorry for him and said he'd give him a chance till tomorrow. And the next day she was following them still, and they drew lots again, and the lot fell on the same man. But the captain said he'd give him a third chance. But the third day, the lot fell on him again. And when they were going to throw him out, he said, "Let me alone just for a while." And he went to the end of the ship, and he began to sing a song in Irish. And when he sang, the mermaid began to be quiet and to rock like as if she was asleep. So he went on singing till they came to America, and just as they got to the land, the ship was thrown up into the air and came down on the water again. There's a man told me that this was surely true. There was a herd's house near Loughree that had a bad name, and a strange woman came in one time and told the woman of the house that she must never throw dirty water out of the back door. "For," said she, "if you had clean linen hanging there on a line before the fire, how would you like anyone to come in and to throw dirty water over it?" Then she bid her to leave food always on her dresser. "For," said she, "wherever you leave it, we'll be able to find it." And she told how they often went into Loughree to buy things and provisions, and would look like any other person and never be known. For they can make themselves visible or invisible as they like. You might be talking to one of them and never know she was different from another. A man named Mulvihill went out spearfishing alone in his boat. It was late, almost sunset, when he saw what he thought was a big fish swimming beside his boat. He thrust the spear and it pierced the big fish. Then this big fish just disappeared into the waters. Frustrated at losing the fish and his spear, Mulvihill returned to shore and went straight home. Late that night, a knock came to his door. He looked out and saw a crowd of people standing there. They asked him to come down to the shore and pull his spear out of the mermaid. Well, he went to the shore and, to his horror, found the mermaid lying there on the sand with his spear piercing her side. Without delay, he pulled the spear out. Then the mermaid spoke to him, thanked him, and asked what she could do for him. He said first he wanted to get home safely, and second, that none of his name would ever die by drowning. Some years later, a group of fishermen were out in a boat, and one of them was a man named Mulvihill. Not the same Mulvihill, but a relation of his. Well, they were out in the deepest part of the lake, Loughree, when the boat sank and they were all drowned. All but the one named Mulvihill. So, could you pick a favourite? Please let me know in the comments if one particular sighting really resonates with you. I'm hoping that my little channel will continue to grow in the coming year. And if you like my videos, you can help. It's easy. just be sure to hit that like button and leave a comment. These little bitty things help me enormously with the beast that is YouTube. And don't forget, you can also join me as a patron or member of the channel, just like Pam, our newest YouTube member. Welcome, Pam, and thank you so much for your support. I hope you'll enjoy your early access to all our videos. And if you'd like to join Pam and be a member of the channel, please check out the notes below for more info on how to join. I'll be back next week with a brand new video that I've been working on for a while. Until then, stay curious. Cheerio.